Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Assessing Organizational Performance After a Crisis. My name is Katie Ingersoll, and I'm the Director of Programs for SMU Data Arts. I also want to introduce my colleague, AJ Taylor, who's here with us today. He's a Support Center Specialist at SMU Data Arts, and AJ will be monitoring our chat and our Q&A. Great. So in order to get us started today, I'm going to start with some housekeeping. So just so you know, everyone will be on mute throughout today's presentation to minimize any background noise, but you do have a couple of options to communicate with us during the presentation. You can use the Q&A feature to ask any questions about the content that you have. I know AJ will be monitoring that during the presentation, and he may get to your questions right away. Or if there's a question that's better to save towards the end, we'll have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation to talk through those questions. There's also the chat feature. You can use the chat to reach out about any technical or logistical issues that you have today. We do have closed captioning available for today's webinar. If you'd like to activate that feature, simply click the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you might be prompted to view closed captioning by live feed or by transcript. After today's session, we will be sending you a follow-up email with a couple of resources related to the presentation, as well as a link to a recording of this webinar and the slides so that you can share this with others or review the content if you'd like. We'll also include a brief survey to get your feedback about today's presentation. So we're really happy to have all of you here today, and you may have seen and heard about this webinar in light of our recent announcement about a change to the KIPI dashboard. Previously, the scores and other information that we're going to look at today were calculated every few months for organizations. That meant that you might have had to wait several months after your data was entered to see your KIPI scores. We now are excited to share that we have automated the process of calculating your KIPI scores, which means that your scores will be available only a few minutes after your survey is complete. So for any of you who have recently filled out a data profile in the last few months, that means your scores for that data profile are available right now. We're really excited about this change, but we also want to make sure that now that you have more immediate access to the dashboard, that you know how to interpret and use the dashboard. And that's what today's webinar is all about. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the theme of today's webinar is assessing organizational performance. We could maybe express this idea as just a question. Is your organization performing well? Now, this might be a short question, but it's certainly not simple, right? This might bring to mind data points and measurements for you, but it also might bring to mind a feeling of uncertainty, especially when working for organizations whose missions are very near and dear to us, and considering that many arts leaders have been focused on keeping our organizations afloat through massive change over the last year. This question also has the potential to be loaded. Today, we want to think about this question as a jumping off point towards the future. Instead of producing uncertainty, hopefully we can think about how assessing performance can help us move our organizations forward. So here will be our agenda for today. We'll start with an overview of the KIPI dashboard. I'll explain kind of what it is, what the scores mean, and how to access it. Then I'll walk through a step-by-step framework you can follow to use the KIPIs at your organization. I'll share a little bit of context about what we're seeing in fiscal year 2020 KIPIs to help you with interpretation of this most recent year. And lastly, I'll apply this framework to an example organization so you can get an idea of how this might go in real life. Before we get into all of that, though, I do want to hear from all of you. I want to know, and I want to ask you to think about how you currently know if your organization is performing well. What's one thing you might notice which would tell you that your organization or even a certain aspect of your programming is performing well? I'm going to ask you to think about this for just a moment and then put your responses in the chat when I say go. We'll do a little chat storm here. A quick note, if you're using the chat, if you want other webinar participants to be able to see your response, make sure to find the drop-down menu above the chat window and select all panelists and attendees. Or you can keep it at all panelists if you prefer it to be a little more private. Okay, so I hope you're thinking about how you know if your organization is performing well. And 1, 2, 3, go. Go ahead and put those answers in the chat and share them with us. We'd love to hear how you get a sense of this at your organization. Great, I see, yes. So things like, yes, when you're in the black, that's a great data point. That is a really good way to measure that. When you're providing opportunities for artists, repeat attendance and participation. Those are great answers. So thank you. And if you're out there achieving your mission, great. Excellent. So thank you for sending those, and feel free to keep putting your answers in the in the chat. I see internal and external clients are happy. Yeah, so looking at these different things that are being cited, board engagement, things like that, some of these are data points, of course. This makes sense for a program that's by SMU Data Arts. After all, we're thinking about data today. But a lot of the things that many of you are citing are what we might call intangible things, things that aren't so easy to measure. The KIPI dashboard is, of course, designed to measure and benchmark your performance on different indicators. It does rely on data and things that can be measured with CDP data. But the KIPI dashboard is also designed to reflect intangible factors, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so I do think it's important to remember that we can't only use data to measure performance. We're going to be talking a lot about data today, but those intangible things that can't be measured in the same way are also really important. So let's start with the basics. What is the KIPI dashboard and where can you find it? So KIPI, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it stands for Key Intangible Performance Indicators. This is a dashboard that provides benchmarking scores on 24 key performance indicators for your organization. Now, before we do dive into the dashboard, I do want to note, just in case, that not all organizations who fill out the CDP will have a KIPI dashboard. There's a couple of exceptions I just want to make sure are clear to you. So organizations with expenses under $50,000 annually fill out a shorter version of the CDP. And we don't have enough data from those organizations to calculate KIPI scores. So if that's you, you won't actually see a KIPI dashboard. Second, the KIPI dashboard also relies on having data from enough organizations like yours to accurately model how your organization operates. I will talk about this more in a moment, but what's important to know here is there are some organizations who fill out the CDP where we don't have enough data on other organizations within their same discipline to model this accurately. So basically, organizations that don't have an NTE code that starts with an A, which is for arts and culture, those organizations won't see a KIPI dashboard either. We do have lots of other tools that you can access to make use of your CDP data if the KIPI dashboard is not available, including analytic reports. I'll talk briefly about those at the end of today's webinar, but we also have a monthly session walking through the breadth of the research and tools that are available from SMU Data Arts. Great, so when you first open up the dashboard, you'll see this overview page. You'll see your organization's name and also information about how your organization is classified. This is based on the data you input into the CDP, including your NTEE code and your total expenses. If you ever think you're classified incorrectly, you can always reach out to our support center and we can assist you with making changes to your organizational data in order to change your classification. Usually this will involve changing your NTEE code. Below, you'll see a series of colored dots, and each colored dot that you see represents one specific indicator or KIPI score. There are 24 indicators in total, divided into 9 broad categories. The color codes here provide a quick visual overview of how you score on different indicators. In general, green means a high score, red a low score, and yellow a score in the middle. We'll talk a lot about this concept later on, but I do want to mention here that not all 24 of these indicators will be relevant to your organization, your mission, and your operating model. We have heard from people that it can feel difficult to see red indicators at first. No one wants to see a lot of red. I totally understand that. But it is important to evaluate each KIPI score individually to see if it's providing relevant feedback to your organization and not get too caught up in the colors right away. So you can click on any of these categories to dive deeper. Let's check out contributed revenue. Within each category, as you start to drill down, you'll start to see your specific scores, which range from 1 to 100. These scores represent percentiles. They're sort of like an SAT score. So if you see a score of 50, that means that 50% of organizations scored higher than you on this particular indicator, and 50% of organizations scored lower than you. For example, in this dashboard for return on fundraising, this organization has a score of 88. This means that they score higher than 88% of their peers on this indicator. But here's where the KIPI dashboard is actually a little bit more complicated than it looks at first. So the dashboard isn't just lining up all the different return on fundraising metrics for all the organizations who fill out the CDP and then calculating your percentile. Now that wouldn't really make sense. There is a large diversity of organizations who complete the CDP. And we wouldn't necessarily expect a large art museum, for example, to perform the same on this metric as a small dance company. They're just very different types of organizations. So instead, the KIPI dashboard is calculating these scores based on a level playing field, taking into account everything our research team can learn about arts organizations and the sector from our CDP data. Let's dig into this a little bit more. Remember, SMU Data Arts has access not just to your KIPI scores and CDP data, but data from thousands of other arts organizations who fill out the CDP around the country. Our research team then connects that organizational data to other sources like census data, data about ticketing, or IRS data. As part of creating the KIPI dashboard, our research team looks at all of this to create a model of the arts and cultural sector. Specifically, this means that our researchers can start to tell what factors tend to influence things like return on fundraising for arts organizations. So this is a graphic from one of our research papers, and I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but through this modeling, our researchers have found that there are some specific forces that tend to drive all these indicators for organizations. This particular graphic explores those force factors for total contributed revenue. So a lot of these are pretty intuitive. For example, you may not be surprised to hear that a greater availability of public funding within your surrounding community tends to lead to higher contributed revenue for arts organizations. You may or may not also be surprised to hear that organizations who target African American audiences primarily or children tend to have this tends to decrease contributed revenue. But whether these are surprising or not, what this modeling allows our researchers to do is to quantify the effects of these forces on things like total contributed revenue. This means that your KIPI scores can also take into account all the factors that might be at work at your organization. So if your organization is in an area that has access to a very high level of public funding, that's taken into account in your scores related to fundraising. Or if you primarily target African Americans as your primary audience, that is also taken into account as well. So if we get back to the dashboard, basically you know that if you have a score of 88 here, that isn't just because your organization is larger or located in a community with more public funding. We've controlled for those factors. So your score here has more to do with the unique strengths of your organization. So let's dive into this metric a little bit more by clicking on it. Return on fundraising is exactly what it sounds like, a metric that tells you how much you raised per each dollar spent on fundraising. What was your return for your investment? It is calculated as total contributed revenue divided by total fundraising expenses. You can always find information about how the metric behind your KIPI score is calculated here on these pages. So given the score, we could say that even accounting for who they are and where they operate, this organization is fundraising more efficiently than 88% of their peers. That's great news. In addition to the score itself, this page also provides more detail about your organization's data. This includes trends in your KIPI scores. You can see how they've changed over the last 5 years. It also includes trends for the two big numbers that calculate this metric. In this case, it's contributed revenue and fundraising expenses. If you hover over the dots on the graph, you can see the specific amounts. These come directly from your cultural data profile. If you're ever working with your KIPI dashboard and you see numbers that seem incorrect to you, you can always go back and make changes to your cultural data profile. Those changes will then be reflected in your dashboard after you resubmit your CDP survey. If you ever need any help with that, our support center is available to help you. So even if you have access to a KIPI dashboard, I want to note that certain KIPI scores may not be calculated. If you pull up your dashboard and notice dots on the homepage that are gray instead of red, yellow, or green, that means we couldn't calculate that KIPI score for you based on your data. Some of these instances are fairly self-explanatory. So for an example, if you entered that you had 0 paid staff in the CDP, we won't be able to calculate CDP scores that relate to staffing. For some of the scores, though, the math is less clear. So if you're ever not sure why a score is not calculated, you can always reach out to the support center for more information. So now that we've walked through the basics of the dashboard, I want to show you how to access it. You can get to your KIPI dashboard from the Data Arts site with just one click. So from the main page of the Data Arts platform, once you log in, click on Performance Indicators from the menu here. On this page, you'll see a few of your KIPIs. And to go to your full KIPI dashboard, click the See Your KIPI Scores button. It'll go ahead and log you right into the dashboard. Okay, so next we're going to transition to talking about how to use the KIPI dashboard. I already showed you what's included, but now I'm going to share a 4-step framework for how to assess and plan using this dashboard. All right, so step 1, before we even get into the data, this step is just to make sure to center your mission during this analysis and assessment process. Specifically, we want to think about how your organization provides value to people and the quality of your programs. Now, this might be a little surprising to you given the data-focused nature of the dashboard, but this is actually backed by research. So here at SMU Data Arts, we obviously believe data is an important tool and resource for arts organizations, but we also know that data can't replace key elements of what makes organizations perform really well. We also have produced research to support this view. So in 2020, we did 2 rounds of research about the alchemy of high-performing arts organizations. So you may have encountered this research when it was released. We held several webinars to kind of walk through these findings, but what you might not know is that this research relied heavily on the data that drives the KIPI dashboard. For both of these studies, which were undertaken in partnership with the Wallace Foundation, our research team started by looking at KIPI scores for organizations and identifying organizations who either ranked very high in terms of their KIPI scores or who had experienced a turnaround, i.e. a marked increase in their scores over the last several years. Once these organizations were identified using data from the KIPI dashboard, our research team conducted structured interviews with leaders from the organizations about their strategies for success. Then our researchers translated what they learned in those interviews into a model of the alchemy of high-performing arts organizations. So the first study was focused on organizations with annual budgets between $650,000 and $4 million. And the second study expanded that budget range to include smaller organizations and also focused on high-performing organizations who primarily serve communities of color. So this is a graphic which shows the findings from the second study, and it illustrates how financial and operational success was linked to the strategies outlined by the leaders interviewed. This is a pretty, it's a pretty complex graphic, so I'm not going to walk through the whole thing, but I just want to highlight a few key things here. So the cornerstones for success identified by the organizations in the study, and remember, these are organizations who have very high KIPI scores. These cornerstones for success actually had nothing to do with data or even with finances at all. The leaders we talked to said that the most important elements of their success, where it kind of started, were community orientation and high quality programming standards. So these are things that we obviously can't measure in the KIPI dashboard, but they should play an important part in your organizational assessment. And based on our research, these things do lead to success in areas measured in the KIPI dashboard, especially when combined with things like adaptive capability, investment in marketing and fundraising, and the ability to plan over a multi-year horizon. So before diving into the KIPI dashboard, take a minute to make sure that you're also thinking about and clear on that question in the top left-hand corner listed here. How will you have created value and for whom? So in step 2, we'll go ahead and open up the dashboard and just explore. First, think about who you want to include in your process with the dashboard. Potentially a group of your colleagues. You might include your board or your leadership team. And even if you start the process on your own just to get oriented, you might plan on sharing your findings with a specific set of colleagues. Start by noticing higher and lower scores. Remember, you can use the colors to guide your exploration to start, and then dig deeper into scores that stand out to you. When you dig into a score, think about the indicator behind that score. What can it tell you and how is it calculated? Remember, the calculations behind each score are available on the page for each score. Make sure to look at trends. Is each indicator trending upward, downward, or is it fairly stable over the last 5 years? Our goal for this initial exploration is to eventually narrow down our focus to 4 to 6 scores we can really dig into for some additional research and assessment to inform our planning. So when you're looking at your higher scores, here are some questions to ask yourself that might be helpful. Are these areas that you currently perceive as strengths for your organization? Is this an area where you were already working towards improvements or making investments? For example, if you've been deliberately investing in grant writing and you pull up the KIPI dashboard and your foundation revenue scores are higher than expected or improving over time, that's great. That's something to be celebrated. You may also notice areas where you scored higher than you would have guessed because those scores take into account what we know about how all organizations operate. So for example, instead of comparing your working capital to a standard benchmark like 3 months or 6 months, your metrics in the dashboard are being compared to the reality within the sector for organizations like yours. This can help provide nuance to conversations around things like working capital. When you look at your low scores, these are questions that might be helpful. First off, when you see a low score, first ask yourself, is this indicator aligned with my strategy and mission? We have 24 indicators that are every indicator is going to be right for an organization, but it might not be right for your organization. So, for example, there are scores that look at earned revenue. If your organization primarily provides free or low-cost programming and you intentionally subsidize that programming with contributions to keep it low cost, then it makes sense that earned revenue scores are going to be low for your organization. So that's an indicator that might be red, but you also don't want to focus too much on it because it doesn't make sense for you. However, if you do see low indicators that are aligned with your organization's mission or strategy, but you still see those low scores, that might be an area to look further at. Make note of that. Remember, there are 24 KIPI scores total. Some of them might not make sense for your organization, but that's still also just a lot of scores to keep in your mind. So this phase is about exploring and then narrowing your focus. Again, you want to end up with 4 to 6 scores that you can dig into more closely. Here are some criteria which might nominate a score for this shortlist. Places where you've been investing that are going well, opportunities to celebrate your success. Unexpected bright spots, maybe you can do some learning about what's driving that success. Mid-range or low scores where improvement does make sense for your organization because they align with your mission and strategy. And also scores that align with existing goals or priorities for your organization. These could be goals that are already written down in some kind of strategic plan, or even just things that come up in conversation a lot among your staff and board. So step 3 is to take this short list of 4 to 6 scores and start to break these down into numbers that will help you plan. So let's imagine for a second that you looked at the KIPI dashboard and then you went back to your colleagues and you said, hey, everybody, let's raise our unrestricted contribution score by 3 points. Ready, set, go. You would probably get a lot of blank looks and no one would actually be sure what you were asking them to do next. That's because these indicators and these scores are solid measures to assess how things are going in specific areas of your organization, but a lot of them are too high level to plan concretely around. When looking at the dashboard, you'll see the 2 numbers used to calculate the indicators. Start there, and then think about more specific data points that are related. Ideally here, we're looking for data points that drive these high-level indicators, but are also more directly connected to decisions we make in our work. Let's take a look at one example. So if we as an organization had chosen to focus on trustee contributions, here's how we might think this through. First, here are the 2 data points used to calculate this indicator: unrestricted trustee contributions and total expenses. So in this case, and actually for many of the KIPIs, total expenses is used here to contextualize this indicator, but it's not going to be our main focus for planning. Here we'll mostly focus on trustee contributions. So we want to start to think through some more specific data points that drive this higher level number. The first thing, of course, that might drive this number is the number of board members who are making contributions. Also, because we have a limited pool of people who can give who are board members, we're going to want to take a look at the total number of board members that we have. We should also look more closely at dollar amounts. What's the average contribution size? We'll also want to examine any policies we have in place that might drive this number. So in this example, do we have a give or get requirement for our board where we require board members to fundraise or contribute a certain amount? We'll want to gather all of these numbers and also look at them as trends. Some of these numbers are also available through SMU Data Art's comparison report, so we could look for some comparative data as well. Examining these more specific numbers will help us start to think through and evaluate specific strategies that might make a difference here. For example, we might decide to change our give or get requirement. Or we might focus on other ways to increase gift size or motivate more board members to give. We might want to review all the points throughout the year that we're asking board members to give. Is it enough? Is it effective? Or finally, we may decide that our board is actually giving about as much as we'd expect them to, and expanding our board is the most effective way to grow this number. We might even decide to pursue multiple of these strategies. The end goal of this step are some more concrete insights for each indicator, more specific data points and insights that might lead to specific decisions, actions, or goals. Some things to keep in mind as you seek more specific data points. You may need to turn to internal sources to find more detailed data. This might mean actually requesting data from whoever manages that specific function, like a development director or a marketing person. This is a good reason to also consider including these people in your overall KIPI dashboard exploration from the beginning. Additional perspectives can help strengthen your exploration. Another place where you can look for more specific data for your organization are the SMU Data Arts Analytic Reports. We have both trend and comparison reports, and many of the indicators used in the KIPI dashboard are also available in these analytic reports, as well as more specific data points to help you plan. As you look at these more specific data points, make sure to examine trends, just like you did with your KIPI scores. And also, if possible, benchmark and compare to peers. Again, you can use the data arts comparison reports for this, or even seek out comparative data from other sources, like research from national service organizations. The final step, step 4, is to ground your planning in thinking about intangibles at your organization. This gets back to our realization at the beginning that when we think about measuring performance at our organization, sometimes we think about data, sometimes we think about other intangible things. We want to make sure we're keeping both in mind through this process. So the first set of important intangibles that we mentioned at the beginning, community orientation and quality programming. We started our process by checking in on these topics, making sure we understood what these meant for our organization, and we want to end here too. There might be certain moments when decisions that you could make based on the data might be in tension with your mission. So, for example, let's think about our board and trustee giving example again. If, as an organization, you have a board whose primary purpose is to provide a direct line of communication with the community you serve, and maybe their role isn't as much fundraising, it's important to think through how expanding the board or asking for a greater financial contribution might affect that. This will depend on the dynamics of your specific board. There also are other intangible factors to consider related to staff and organizational capacity. So this might include marketing and fundraising skill. For example, if you're focusing on improving your fundraising outcomes, just setting higher goals alone probably won't be enough. You might need to seek out additional expertise, either in the form of training for existing staff or additional help. Do you need additional investment and capacity to achieve your goals? These are just two examples, and each organization is different, but this step is just a reminder to vet your data-driven research and your analysis against your organization's overall context and mission. Once you've gone through this process to really dig into 4 to 6 indicators from the KIPI dashboard, hopefully you will have learned a lot about how your organization is performing and have some concrete goals to pursue. This is the moment to connect what you've learned to any planning processes you already have in place at your organization. First is your annual budget process. This, of course, is the yearly process when you set revenue goals and plan your spending for the upcoming year. This is a great place to implement some of the things you've explored in your work with the KIPI dashboard. If you don't currently go through an annual budgeting process or you're new to it, we do have a recorded webinar about budgeting that I'll send out in our follow-up email that you can take a look at. You may also undertake longer-term financial planning over a 3, 5, or even longer time horizon. This kind of financial planning can help you implement changes and plans that go beyond a single year. You may go through strategic planning at your organization. If you already have a strategic plan, make sure to review it before you explore the KIPI dashboard so it can inform your assessment. If you're considering strategic planning soon, incorporate your KIPI dashboard assessment into that process. Finally, depending on what you find, your assessment might inform planning for more specific projects like an annual giving campaign or maybe your marketing activities for the year. So that was a general overview of how to use the KIPI dashboard. But before we move on to walk through an example, I do want to acknowledge that 2020 was a particularly complex year, to put it simply. Many organizations had to drastically modify their programming and make a lot of changes to navigate 2020. And a lot of organizations are still navigating uncertainty. All of this to say that if your organization experienced changes in your programming and finances over the last year, it is likely that you'll see accompanying shifts in your KIPI scores. That is completely normal. You may see KIPI scores go down in areas where you've historically been doing really well, also really normal. So I do want to just offer some context about overall trends in KIPI scores that our research team have noticed for fiscal year 2020. These aren't, this isn't a research or a paper or a white paper, but just some things that we've noticed tend to be true for a lot of organizations when we look at fiscal year 2020 overall. They're certainly not universal, but hopefully if you can keep these in mind as you look at your own KIPI scores, they can provide some context. First, we see decreases in scores associated with earned revenue, attendance, and program offerings. This makes sense given the shutdowns and interruptions to program activity across the country. Fewer attendees and less earned revenue coming in will naturally lead to decreases in these scores. Second, many organizations' expenses decreased, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of organizations had to make difficult management decisions to cut programming or maybe even furlough or lay off staff in response to the loss of revenue. Or organizations simply didn't need to make the expenditures on programs that they normally would. This is important for the KIPI scores because many of the KIPI scores take total expenses into account, usually as a way to put other indicators into context. For example, both of the fundraising KIPI scores we've already looked at use total expenses as the denominator or the bottom number in their calculation. For this reason, when expenses decrease, they can actually lead to increases in your KIPI scores, or at least keep scores stable if other measures such as earned revenue are also decreasing at the same time. Next, we see an increase in scores related to contributions of all types, with the exception of corporate contributions. This is collaborated by other research that showed an increase in individual contributions at the beginning stages of the pandemic. We also know that many government and private foundations provided emergency funding during this period. This generosity from individual and institutional funders in fiscal year 2020 seems to be reflected in organizations' KIPI scores. KIPI scores related to the bottom line were relatively stable overall. Bottom line refers to whether organizations are operating in a surplus or deficit. This signals that for many organizations, the difficult decisions they made to cut their expenses, as well as new sources of support they found, meant they were able to avoid operating at a deficit, or maybe we could say operating at a greater deficit than they normally would. Finally, working capital for many organizations was slightly improved. This is probably a result of the stable bottom line and cost management measures already mentioned above. So these are the trends that our research team sees across a lot of organizations' KIPIs for fiscal year 2020. I'm actually curious for those of you here today, which if any of these match your experience. So I'm going to launch a poll, and this just asks you to share with us if any of these resonate with your organization's experience in fiscal year 2020. Now, unfortunately, our polling feature will only let you select one of these options, so I'll just ask you to pick the one that most strongly resonates with your organizational experience, even if probably multiple are true. So I'll go ahead and leave that open and just ask everybody to weigh in about which of these resonates with you. If any, you can also choose none of these if you had a different experience in 2020. Great. So I'm going to leave that open for another couple of seconds. Thank you all for voting. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and just share the results with you. So yeah, it does look like this idea of a decrease in earned revenue, attendance, or program activity is obviously really resonant with everyone on the webinar today. So yeah, I will say that you'll see that in your KIPI scores, but if you kind of go in expecting it and thinking about, trying to sort through whether it is an anomaly or something that you might have to plan for the next couple of years, that's a good way to just think about those changes. Okay. Great, thank you everyone. I'm going to stop sharing the results and we'll go ahead and continue on. And so what we're going to do is now we're going to walk through an example organization. And I'm going to walk through each of those 4 steps I just talked about, just to give you an example of what this might look like. Our example organization in this case is the Community Dance Company. Great. So our first step here is to center our mission, of course, and make sure we understand who we provide value to. So let's take this opportunity actually to get to know the example cultural dance company and what they do. So their mission is to promote cultural expression through movement in their community. They have very popular education programs for youth and adults that are highly valued by participants. They also give performances, both by students as well as professional dancers, and these performances help them maintain a connection with a broader group beyond those who participate in their education programs. In 2020, they were shut down completely for a few months and then were able to move classes online. And now they're currently in a hybrid situation with some in person and some online classes, and they are planning their first in-person performance in the fall. So step 2 for the example cultural dance company is going to be to explore the dashboard with this goal of developing a short list of 4 to 6 metrics to focus on. In this case, the example cultural dance company is going to gather together their leadership team of 3 people, and they're going to take a look at the dashboard together just so they can talk a little bit about the scores. So let's take a look at their dashboard. So we can start with their homepage, and I'm going to start with the high scores, those green scores. One area that I see that's very green is earned revenue. So I'm going to take a closer look there. So again, if you were going through this dashboard yourself, you might take a look at all of the scores, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on a few different categories and one score within each. So I'm going to go ahead and dive deeper into the first score listed here, earned revenue, for example, cultural dance company. So this indicator provides the percentage of your total expenses that are covered by your earned revenue. Their score for fiscal year 2020 is 76. So we can see here that it's gone down a bit in 2020, which we would expect and aligns with the general trends we discussed, this kind of decrease in earned revenue. However, this is still a very high score, and this has been a historic strength for them. This makes sense to the leadership team since a lot of their focus is on their education program for which they earn tuition. This is an opportunity to celebrate the loyal following they've built for the education programming and their ability to maintain this revenue stream, maybe not steady, but maintain at least some portion of it over this last tough year. So if we go back to the home screen to continue our exploration, another area with multiple green dots is bottom line. So if we dive into this category, we see 3 scores. I'm going to take a closer look at the first, operating surplus before depreciation. So this is another area of historic strength for this organization, an area where the organization has made improvements over the last 5 years. This is interesting because it looks like the organization made a pretty big shift in their size in 2016, and it has been sort of managing their expenses over time downwards. This would be a good point for discussion with the leadership team. Had this been a deliberate plan to right-size their spending or something that has happened more organically over time? And how can this trend inform their future planning? It's worth noting here that if we compare their total revenue and expenses, if we were to actually do some math here with their cultural data profile, the operating surplus this organization has had for 2019 and 2020 is between $30,000 and $40,000. For many larger organizations, that would be a fairly small surplus, but the dashboard is telling us that as a medium dance company, this is a relatively strong performance. So this is an example of where you might find some positive surprises in the KIPI dashboard, areas where you're operating beyond what we would expect given who you are and where you operate. Let's go back to the home page and start to examine some of those lower red scores. So the contributed revenue section is interesting because they kind of have a mix of scores here. We have some green and some yellow and some orange. So let's take a closer look. We can see here that they have very high scores for unrestricted contributions and also very high scores for trustee contributions. And it's a little bit cut off here, but their scores for foundation support and government support are also fairly high. This means that they're able to cover a relatively high percentage of their total expenses with these types of revenue compared to their peers. Their return on fundraising score is right in the middle, meaning they are average in terms of their fundraising efficiency, given who they are and how they operate. Their score on individual contributions is particularly low, which might point to some opportunity for growth there in comparison to their peers. Let's take a closer look at this score. We can see that they have improved on this score over the last few years, but are still relatively low compared to their peers. So this might be an area of opportunity for them. Remember, when you're looking at lower scores, pause to make sure they are indicators that fit well with your mission and strategy. So when the example community dance company thinks about individual contributions, they do know that many of their most ardent supporters already do pay tuition for classes at the school. So they worry that there might be kind of a natural limit in terms of additional donations they could receive from that particular group. However, they discuss that there may be other community members who might be willing to support the company with a contribution who are not already paying tuition. So they'll proceed with caution here, not wanting to expect more than is realistic for anyone already participating in their programs, but also open to potentially cultivating new sources of individual contributions. If they head back to the home screen, we also can see that they have lower scores in community engagement. So they're going to dig into this. This feels surprising to the leadership team, but also potentially related to the year they've just had. So if we dive into community engagement for a moment, we can see two scores: total engagement and in-person engagement. Total engagement is going to include your virtual attendance. So in-person engagement scores are very low for this year. But again, this is something we see in a lot of organizations right now, and it makes perfect sense given operating conditions in fiscal year 2020. Their total engagement score is right in the middle of 50. So I'm going to go ahead and take a closer look here. If they dive more closely into this score, we can actually see that they have had a positive upward trend in this area up until 2020 when they have this dip down to 50. Again, this is to be expected given the operating conditions of fiscal year 2020. So this is probably not cause for a major alarm. However, they do want to keep a close eye on this to see how things go as they bring back in-person programs, but also probably retain some virtual programming. Can they build back to their previous performance over the next couple of years? If we go back to the dashboard, another area with lower scores is expenses. If we dig into this category, we'll see there are two related scores here: investment in programs and investment in program personnel and investment in programs. Let's look more closely at the first, investment in program personnel. So this indicator looks at the percentage of your total expenses devoted to program personnel. They see that they're performing below their peers here. They know they had to furlough some staff for a period during 2020. This was an unusual year, so this is a moment when they really need to examine the trends over time. Was this an anomaly during a tough year, or is this a bigger trend? If they dive into the trends here, we can actually see that this was certainly exacerbated during fiscal year 2020, but that their scores over the last few years have been decreasing in this area with the exception of an increase in 2018. So this feels like an important conversation to the leadership team because their teachers and program staff are the heart of their education program, but they know that they've struggled to raise teacher pay over the years. They definitely want to highlight this indicator to look at further. So after their initial tour through the dashboard, the leadership team of the Example Cultural Dance Company has a short list of 5 metrics that are important to them. They are earned revenue. They're performing well here. They want to continue to keep this metric front and center to build on their success. Operating surplus. They've had success with operating in a modest surplus over the years, and they score pretty high on this indicator. Because the other indicators on this list might prompt them to raise revenue and expenses to invest in staff, they want to make sure they're keeping their bottom line front and center so they can continue their habit of surpluses. So this is an important metric to them. Individual contributions. This was a potential area for growth as they were looking at their scores. Total engagement. They've been doing really well on this score, but they had a very understandable dip in fiscal year 2020. They want to keep an eye on this to understand how they're doing as they bring back in-person programming, but retain some virtual programs. And finally, investment in program personnel. They know that their staff are key to their great programming and their community relevance, and teacher pay has come up before in their conversations. So this KIPI score resonates with something they already know and talk about at their organization. This reinforces the need to prioritize this indicator. Okay, so this brings us to our third step in our process, for example, Cultural Dance Company, to look more closely at these indicators and break them down into more specific data points that can help us plan. I'm going to focus on 3 of these metrics in this example, just for the sake of time. First, let's look at earned revenue. This indicator is calculated as total earned revenue divided by total expenses. So they want to focus on earned revenue here to think about what more specific data points inform this high-level indicator. When it comes to understanding their earned revenue, they want to start by looking at the breakdown of earned revenue by different sources. In order to do this, Example Cultural Dance Company can run a program activity trend report. This, of course, is from the Data Arts platform as well. And this shows us that the education program revenue makes up the majority of their earned revenue consistently over time. From here, they may want to dive into specific data points related to this program. This could include pricing information for in-person and online classes, information about the number of students or the number of students they retain each year. They should also look at trends in these areas and think about benchmarking data. Again, this is a metric where they score pretty highly, so they aren't necessarily going to make drastic changes, but they do want to understand how they are doing here, especially with all the changes to their programs in fiscal year 2020. Another area they want to look more closely at was individual contributions. So this indicator is calculated as total unrestricted individual contributions divided by total expenses. So this indicator relies on total individual contributions as its main data point. We want to look at this data point and how it's changed over time. But they can also go further and look at how many individual contributors they have each year, as well as average contribution size. This may help them think through whether they are more likely to find success in recruiting a large pool of smaller donors or cultivating existing donors to give greater amounts or more frequently. This information can be found on the fundraising trend report in the data arts system. Because we know that they are also conscious of the fact that their supporters also financially contribute through tuition payments and may not be able to support further donations, it might make sense for them to go ahead and do an overlap analysis to see what overlap there is between class participants, attendees of their programs and performances, and their existing individual donors. Finally, we'll look at investment in program personnel. This indicator is calculated as program personnel expenses divided by total expenses. So for this indicator, they'll want to start with their program personnel expenses and then break that down further. This might include looking at the number of part-time and full-time staff and independent contractors. They can also access the staffing comparison report from the Data Arts platform to help them do this analysis. This is a comparison report, so it includes their data as well as data from a comparison group. They can also look at wages for their program staff and compare them to the living expenses in their city, or they might think about benchmarking data from wages for teaching artists across the country. Often national service organizations could be a great source for data like that. Finally, here it will be very important to work on budget scenarios that project wage increases over time to understand their implications for their broader budget. The last step for example cultural dance is to consider the intangibles such as community relevance and high quality programming and staff and organizational capacity. Some things they might discuss. Planning to invest in program staff will likely strengthen the quality of their programs and community, so it feels like the right step to the leadership team. When thinking about individual donors, they're unsure if participants in their educational programming have more to give. Would it feel right to ask people who are already paying tuition to also make an individual donation? Can they confirm this by talking to some of their more devoted participants, either informally or as part of a focus group? Do they need to invest in capacity building for their fundraising staff as they consider expanding their efforts towards individual donations? After this exploratory process with the KIPI dashboard, it will be helpful for them to consider the rest of the planning that happens at their organization and how they can fold what they've learned into those processes. So in this case, many of the goals they talked about are related to what revenue they'll raise and what they spend. So their annual budgeting process is going to be an important place to incorporate some of these new ideas. They may also want to consider some longer term financial planning to see if their wage increase can be sustainable over time. And finally, what they learn can be incorporated into specific projects that might come up throughout the year, like planning an annual giving appeal for individual contributions or recruitment for the education program. So that was a quick overview of how an organization might start to explore the KIPI dashboard, pick 4 to 6 metrics that matter, and then dive more deeply into these metrics for their organization to inform their planning. And here's a quick recap of the 4 steps that we used. Before we take your questions and wrap up today, I do want to share with you some additional resources that are available to you from SMU Data Arts. So we also provide analytic reports. So I touched on these a little bit when I was walking through my example, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that in addition to the KIPI dashboard, you can run reports that use your CDP data. This includes the annual report, which is a nice overview of your data that can be used for stakeholders, trend reports that look at changes in your data over time, and comparison reports that allow you to compare to peer organizations. When you're running comparison reports, you'll be able to choose and set criteria to determine what your comparison group will be. We also publish research reports that make use of the same data that the KIPI dashboard draws upon. It makes use of the data that you probably submit through your cultural data profile. You can find all of our most recent research on our research page, which I'll include a link to in our follow-up email. And lastly, we have ongoing training opportunities available, as well as recordings of recent sessions. So I want to highlight 2 for you today. So we do have a monthly Data at Work webinar that dives more deeply into those analytic reports that I talked about. So if you're interested in that, there's one coming up. We also recently had a financial building blocks series. This was targeted at small organizations looking to kind of brush up on their financial management techniques. And that series did just wrap up on Tuesday, but they all are recorded. So if you're interested, you can find the recordings at the link that AJ just put in the chat. Great. I also just wanted to give you a little bit of information about how to follow us on social, where we frequently share updates about our trainings and our research. And that's it. So we do have about 10 minutes for questions. So I will pause and take a look at the Q&A. Great. Great. And so I do see a question which I'll answer here. I see that AJ answered it, but I'll just share it out loud. Someone asked if for organizations who kind of go above and below the 50K threshold, will they be able to access reports for years when they had expenses over $50,000, which is, yes, that is the case. If you have expenses over $50,000 in a certain year, you'll see a KIPI dashboard for that year. But then if your expenses kind of dip below 50K, you won't see a dashboard for those years when you're under. Great. So yeah, so I would encourage anyone, if you have any questions at all, to go ahead and put those questions in the chat, and we will be here to take your questions or the Q&A. All right, well, great. Well, again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and for your interest in the KIPI dashboard. Oh yeah, so we will provide the website. So actually, Tim just asked to provide the website again. So in order to find the dashboard that I just talked about, you'll want to go to the Data Arts platform. And I'm going to ask AJ to put a link to the Data Arts platform in the chat. But what you'll do is you'll log in. So this will be the same login you use when you enter your data into the cultural data profile. There may be, thanks AJ, there may be someone else at your organization who does that data entry. So if you don't currently enter data, you can set up an account and get access to your organization's account. And then once you log in, you'll go ahead and find the performance indicators link, and then that will take you to the dashboard. So again, to find your organization's specific data points, you'll want to log in and go ahead and access the KIPI dashboard. In order to find the kind of the general reports and research that I shared, we can put a link in the chat to our research page. I'll grab that so that you can find our general research is available here. Great, good question. Great, and we will send a follow-up email where we'll put links to more information, and we'll also send the slides so you can kind of review how to get to certain things. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're so appreciative of you taking the time and taking this time out of your afternoon. And if you have any questions about the KIPI dashboard or anything that came up today, you do have the information for the Data Arts Support Center here. You can always be in touch with them and they can help you find your KIPI dashboard, or if you have any questions about anything you see in the dashboard, they'll do their best to help support you as you use it. Great. All right, well, seeing no further questions, we'll end the audio portion of this presentation. We'll probably stay on for another minute or two in case anything comes up in the chat. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.